Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, December the 4th. This morning, I can reveal ongoing tensions between number 10 and number 11 over the budget. I'm told some of Keir Starmer's closest aides have been criticising the way communications was handled in the run-up to last week's big event. This is despite the creation of a joint board in September that was meant to bind number 10 and number 11 together. But I am told there are still cracks appearing. And while Keir Starmer has been careful to co-own the budget, other senior figures in number 10 are making clear they are not impressed. And that's all about the mess beforehand. They've been pointing the fingers next door. Students of the last 2 decades of Labour history know how damaging divisions between number 10 and number 11 can be. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And in perfect unison on this podcast, I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. At the weekend, we read allies of Rachel Reeves saying she and only she could take credit for the budget. An ally of Reeves telling the Observer this is Rachel Reeves's budget, not the budget board's budget or the Treasury's budget or the OBR's budget. Stirring stuff. Now, it would seem, Sam, from your comments, that some in number 10 are only too happy to agree they weren't in control of every aspect.
Yeah, there does seem to be a bit more than a cigarette paper between them, isn't there? Yesterday, we learned that there'd be a formal leak inquiry into the stuff that emerged into the public domain in the run-up to the budget. Good luck with that. One of the consequences of a leak inquiry is that tensions will endure. Don't underestimate how unpleasant they are for the people involved. People have to hand over their phones. They get interviewed if it's done properly. So they really do have an impact on morale, which doesn't feel very high to me across government. Nor will help is the intervention of Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy, who kindly threw in his tuppence into the mix yesterday, telling the newsagents that he has been really disappointed with some of the leaks we've been experiencing in government and warned leaking cabinet colleagues to stop it.
David Lammy's comments really lay bare some of the challenges inside the government at the moment. He also said in the last few weeks, government had not been working at its best. I've never liked infighting among politicians and within parties, David Lammy said, and I don't think the public like it. Now, that's quite a statement because it does appear to be pointing the finger at person or persons around the cabinet table that he sits at.
Yeah, and also just acknowledging that there's infighting, right? Just as allies of Keir Starmer appeared to acknowledge that his grip on power was very weak 2 weeks ago with that extraordinary briefing against Wes Streeting, here we have the Deputy Prime Minister basically saying we're all beset by infighting, and that just sends a big message, and that has consequences. Important consequences that I just want to pause on for 1 minute, Anne. I've been having all sorts of chats with people around government in the last couple of days about the mood inside Whitehall and how they're getting on with trying to get things done. And there are pockets of proper despair at the moment, not consequential ones in terms of coups or anything like that, but slightly more under the radar, under the surface ones. One person in government described how they struggle to get reforms done right now. And I'm going to sort of quote them. So here we go. The blob is against us now. It's just very hard to get things done. You know, the way that things are meant to work is that you need to get something happening, agreement from number 10, the department that we work in and the Treasury. But what started happening is that the junior official in our department who needs to make contact with, say, the junior official in the Treasury, well, they've just started taking many days longer than they previously did for seemingly no reason. And so nothing happens at the speed that you need it. You don't see any of this on the surface, but it slows everything right down and makes it impossible to get things done, right? That's the assessment of somebody I was talking to in the last few days, which I think is why there are these pockets of despair. So some things are happening. The government isn't dead. There are apparently lots and lots of write rounds going on. So you'll see announcements coming in the next few days. But below the surface in other parts of the machine, and my sources are telling me, really, they're responding to the top level chaos by just not backing this government and helping it get stuff over the line.
A few quick things to cover off before we get into the main thrust. There is likely to be controversy over the delay to 4 mayoral elections that were due to take place in May next year, but now set to be postponed by 2 years, pushed to 2028. There are elections for Essex, Hampshire, and the Solent, Sussex, and Brighton, and also Norfolk and Suffolk. It's the second time these elections have been delayed. The government will argue it just needs more time to create these combined authorities, because they are intended to be a lot bigger than what they replace. But Tories are saying it is a scandalous attempt to subvert democracy, essentially dodging having more elections, and reform, of course, in full cry, saying an act of desperate government clinging onto power. The Lib Dems chiming in, democracy delayed is democracy denied.
One of the sort of conspiracy theories around all of the decisions to delay this particular slice of elections is that if those mayoral elections happen next year, as was originally scheduled, then they would happen under first past the post, because that's the voting system currently in force. But by delaying to 2028, the English Devolution Bill will have been passed and be in law, and that changes the voting system for these mayoralties back to a more Labour-friendly single transferable vote. One person called that grubby. I have to say, I'm not sure having mayoral elections sort of delayed is going to make very much difference to the big picture of what goes on in May, because that'll be determined by what happens in Scotland and Wales. That's the main barometer. But this sort of stuff does raise the blood pressure of rival political parties. And I think Keir Starmer knows the importance of May, as we'll find out in a moment, because he's heading to Scotland.
Well, indeed. Let's look at today at Westminster. The German state visit is fully unterwegs. Herzliches Willkommen to President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who will be speaking in Parliament. We might see some movement in the next few days following talks behind the scenes there on what this youth experience idea might look like to get this youth mobility thing across the line. Keir Starmer is meeting the Norwegian PM, Jonas Gahr, in number 10, as the MOD announces a defence agreement that will see British and Norwegian navies operating side by side in the North Atlantic to, quote, counter Russian undersea threat, close quote. And then they both head up to Scotland for a joint visit to RAF Lossiemouth.
This is part of what we're told is a historic anti-Putin push by Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer wanting to talk about the Russian leader. Actually, so do we, and that's what we're going to spend some time doing in a moment. This tie-up, though, between the UK and the Norwegian navies, reading about it, it suggests that the navies will be able to operate an interchangeable fleet of Type 26 sub-hunting frigates with high-tech vessels sharing maintenance facilities, equipment and tech, essentially creating one combined navy to hunt Putin's deep sea fleet. There's a lot of chatter about Russian incursions on essentially European undersea architecture. So it's all a big deal. But the fact that the PM is banging the drum for anti-Putin message is the perfect launching pad for two related areas that, frankly, are much, much more complicated. And I want to hear from you about, Anne. The first is on Ukraine. The other is on defence spending. But let's start with UK and Ukraine, which you've been looking into.
I have, Sam, and you're right. These two things are, I think, getting more and more tightly interlinked, and some of the tensions that you pointed out at the top of the podcast about how delivery is being slowed down in government are also germane here, obviously in an area of high threat and a lot of worry. So on Ukraine first, after the shuttle diplomacy to Moscow by the US, Putin, his saber rattling on being ready for conflict with Europe, so he used the occasion to double down on that. There's a meeting today in Miami of Steve Witkoff and Rustem Umerov from the Ukrainian National Security Council. It feels like an update, Sam, really not a breakthrough. I was busy making a Westminster Insider episode this week. That's out tomorrow, that podcast, on what the thinking is really behind the scenes on our role in the coalition of the willing. How are we going to deliver security guarantees if this deal ever staggers across the line to end the fighting in Ukraine? And what jumped out to me as I did some ferreting around is the deep background unhappiness among heads of services, even defence-minded Labour MPs, at the pace of defence spending rises, which we know have been very well trailed, very promised by this government, and huge irritation, Sam, to the scanty references to this in Rachel Reeves's budget and a lack of clarity about, well, basically, when does the money actually emerge? And it's coming to a head because John Healey, when he comes back from trips which are very media friendly to celebrate bipartisan deals on submarines and the like. He would like to get a big formal statement out on spending next tranches before Christmas. But I'm told that the Treasury is dragging its feet there, can't make the sums add up. And that's why there was such a thin mention of anything in the budget to do with this. So we have this big pledge, 3% spending over the next few years. But actually, where's the beef?
Okay, that really is interesting. So just a sort of attention klaxon. When Anne McElvoy tells you that the deep state is unhappy about something, I think people need to sit up and pay attention, because the deep state will be unhappy. And that is never a good position for politicians to be in when that incredibly influential caucus of people, essentially defined as people that speak to Anne, express their displeasure.
That is my definition of the deep state. It's a fair point, but it's also true.
And we know it's true. We absolutely know it's true, because a bit of this popped above the surface yesterday, because I was reading about an interview with Lord George Robertson, the former NATO chief. He most pertinently in this debate is the author of Keir Starmer's Strategic Defence Review, right? And he went on the airwaves, and this will have been a deliberate, pointed intervention in order to say, and it was to LBC, Andrew Barr, that the government has agreed to raise the defence budget to 3.5% of GDP, right? Currently, it's going to hit 2.5% in 2027. And Lord Robertson was going on the airwaves to point the finger at Rachel Reeves and says, and here's what he said, it's like incredibly pointed. I think the pressure needs to be at the Chancellor. She needs to know what she signed up to, because she signed up to the Strategic Defence Review. It's a government publication. She's going to have to recognise that as a fact of life. So that's essentially the guy who authored the most important document that the government has seen on defence going, no point in doing creative accounting, Rachel. You are going to have to come up with the hard cash, because that's what we've promised. And that sounds to me like it's an above-the-line intervention that completely reflects all the things you were just telling us that's going on below the line.
I think George Robinson absolutely, as you picked up there, Sam, is acting, if you like, as the front man who can say these things publicly, can say it on the airwaves, which armed forces chiefs and others are saying strongly behind the scenes. And one aspect which sort of, it was a bit like in my bat ear about the budget, probably yours as well. It's like, well, why was there just such a thin mention of essentially of national security, which follows from the Ukraine war, but goes much broader than that? Why do we hear less from the PM about this? One of my sources pointing out that Starmer is now foregrounding, talking about freezing assets. That seems to be coming on quite well. There's a bit of deal in Brussels on that this week for the Russians, obviously, to pay for the damage in Ukraine, and sanctions, but not so much about actual weapons, security, getting towards that 3% and ultimately 3.5% target of spending as a proportion of GDP by 2035. Here's a great quote I heard along the way. The full metal issue is that the political will is hitting the reality of the civil service. Back again to things being slowed down, and the idea that savings just will not be enough to particularly get anywhere near that pledge. So John Healey is now coming under pressure himself to get more clarity about this before Christmas. In fairness to John Healey as Defence Secretary, sounds like he's probably putting pressure on Rachel Reeves and the Treasury, and it's ring a roses. But this, I think, the bad mood is now becoming very apparent, and you heard George Robertson reflecting it there.
Yeah, if I was to sum up a couple of dynamics there, it's not really up to the civil service to find efficiency savings that have been built into the system as an excuse for a real saving that could automatically generate the cash that's necessary for defence. If you do a bit of creating accounting earlier in the year, then don't be surprised if that money isn't real later in the year when you suddenly find that you need to find it. And we did look at the long tail. Well, I do remember the sort of long tail of the 3.5% announcement, and it was quite clear then that there was a lot of aspiration and not very much kind of specificity. But this also plugs into another dynamic that somebody was talking about in the last 24 hours about how things are working in government, which is however bold you want to be in a government department, the dynamic at the moment is number 10's vibe and their reaction to stuff is don't take any risks. So if a policy area involves trade-offs and trade-offs that might be politically complicated, then they kind of back away from it. And this is another issue that makes it harder to get reforms done, change done, because at the moment, number 10 is just desperate to keep MPs on side and not do anything that upsets the apple cart. But anything that is difficult will upset people. And that's it's not just the civil service goes slow that means that stuff isn't happening on time. And that line that John Healey might not get his statement over the line before Christmas is a great little scoop and one to watch. But I think it is symptomatic of what people all the way elsewhere in government are finding and feeling.
I think John Healey is pretty determined that something should happen. But I think where he's under pressure, it's an interesting way to look at it, the way you framed it there, that it's about avoiding risk. At the same time, as we all know in life and politics and spending departments, the longer you allow pressures to build up, the more that when it all bursts out into the open, Sam, you have people now beginning to talk about the fact that major programs might need to be cut by the MOD in order to keep this spending pledge on track. So yes, it's very nice. With Playbook reporting in detail this morning what this visit is going to look like to Scotland with the Norwegians. We're going to have the Germans talking about on the state visit, talking about the Anglo-German Defence Agreement, going deeper on that, drone production and all those good things. But at the same time, we are now getting MPs under pressure because they're hearing from defence entities in their constituencies that they can't get orders because the MOD is dragging its feet on putting through orders. And just one example is the Leonardo factory in Yeovil, which is making this new medium helicopter, which is supposed to be one of the big bits of kit that needs to change and expand very quickly, is saying very openly that it needs movement on this, otherwise it is getting into danger on that project and even overall. So I think the pressures are building up with backbenchers as well as on Healey and on the Treasury.
It is the season for predictions and projections, and we'll have a lot more of those as December unfold. But one of my sort of early feelings about 2026 is that if 2025 was the year that Keir Starmer established that he was a foreign policy prime minister in many ways and embraced it, 2026 is the year where that really actually starts to hit back and in some cases hurt. So you've got exactly what you identify, the challenges around the military budget. You've also got the associated fact that we talked about earlier in the week that Britain has been unable to sign up to the EU defence procurement deal, the SAFE deal, because we wouldn't pay the money into it. I also led on top of that, think that there are huge challenges in the way that we are about to encounter with our relationship with Europe. They whacked us on steel earlier in the autumn. We've just not been able to sort it out. We're going to run a very complicated negotiation in order to remove barriers on food and agriculture, over the border, and put through legislation in parallel without knowing the outcome of the negotiation. That will be tricky as well. And then you've got the fallout from whatever happens in Ukraine, which does not look like it's going in Keir Starmer's direction, even though there has been so much effort to try and steer Donald Trump into the right place on that. That is a challenge too. So I think a bit of the foreign policy stuff that Keir Starmer's invested a lot of personal capital in feels pretty challenging right now against a backdrop of domestic challenge as well. So that is my projection for next year. I have to say, it sounds like you need to listen to your Westminster Insider podcast, though, in order to fully understand that element of the challenge, why the deep state is so upset by Anne McElvoy. You're never going to want to miss out on that.
That'll be out tomorrow morning when I finish making it.
Brilliant. Well, that's pretty much us to time. Thank you very much indeed for listening for this week. We will be rattling back into your feeds on Monday morning for Politics at Sam and Anne's. Let's see what everything is thrown up then.
See you on Monday, Sam.
Hey, it's Sophie and Will from Sky News.
Too many headlines, too little time?
We get it, and that's why we're bringing you Cheat Sheet.
10 minutes every weekday morning.
All the big stories from politics to pop culture, minus the noise.
No doom scrolling, no spin, just the stories that matter from two people who live and breathe the news. Cheat Sheet with Ridge and Frost from Sky News.
Follow Cheat Sheet wherever you get your podcasts.